welcome. You're listening to the Just Love Them podcast. I'm your host, Cherie Best. Join me on a journey to understand and to find peace with those we love who have left their faith. Different people come into my space that I feel prompted to have on this podcast. I have people with lots of different experiences. Some people have been through having loved ones leave the faith, and they have their own wisdom to share, their own insights, and what they've learned that could help somebody else. I also interview experts who are marriage and family therapists or who counsel those who are on the other side, the ones who've left the faith. I've interviewed those who are inactive and those who are active. Today, I have a very special guest, Natalie Hoose. Natalie is a convert to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. She went to BYU. She lived in Jerusalem for a semester. She's currently a medical student at the University of Utah. And Natalie and I met a few years ago. I was working as a nurse at the wound clinic, and she was also working at the wound clinic. And we just connected. Even though we are decades apart in age, we just connected. I have just loved having Natalie as a close friend. Natalie is wise beyond her years. She has a lot of tenacity. She loves God, and she has incredible perspective on life. We are so lucky to have Natalie. She's in the middle of medical school now and doesn't have a lot of time. So this is really, really a gift to get to interview Natalie today. About a year ago, no, more than a year ago, Natalie came and stayed at my house when she was interviewing to go to medical school. And we got into a conversation that involved this topic. And this was before I ever even started the podcast, if I remember correctly. I knew I was going to start it, but I hadn't yet started this podcast. And we just had this conversation. And so I've had Natalie on my radar for a year, and we've talked several times about when was the right time to have her on as a guest. And today is that lucky day. So welcome, Natalie.
Thank you, Cherie.
I'm so excited that you're here. Every time you and I talk about this topic, I just learn from you. And so I'm so excited to hear whatever you have in mind that you want to share today. Where do you want to start?
I guess I could start with a little bit of background about my conversion story. I feel like that's really important to give kind of like a 30,000 foot view of my perspective leading up to now. Wasn't born into the church, and it was something that I came upon while I was in high school. I was doing a lot of theater, and I had two very fabulous theater teachers who were married and went to BYU and came and taught at our high school. They brought a lot of the members into the theater program with them, and they were just fabulous people. And I was having a really hard time because my family was going through a bit of a crisis. I was baptized Lutheran when I was 7, and I really wanted to be baptized. My mother read to me the Bible growing up a lot, and I had a deep-rooted faith. That was tested when I was 12, when one of my friends passed away suddenly. And I looked at a bunch of different faiths at that point because I wasn't sure which one was real. I could never shake the feeling that I had a savior that loved me and that spoke on my behalf to an all-powerful being. So I stuck with Christianity, but I never really committed to a denomination. I just kind of church hopped with my friends, and it gave me a lot of perspective and appreciation for a lot of the different emphases, I would suppose is a good way to say it, for different denominations. But when I was getting ready to go to college, I felt like I needed a lot more structure, and I needed dedicated time to study and to be around other people who also believed. And the LDS church just spoke to me a lot. I liked their plan of eternal happiness, and I liked the idea that a family could be together forever. And it was something that just very intuitively was like, oh, I already had a lot of these assumptions growing up. The older I got in some of the other denominations, a lot of people actually, and I can't speak for everybody, but when I would talk to my friends, they held these beliefs deeply within them. But then when we would go to Sunday school or we would go to church, it wasn't very central and it wasn't talked about a whole lot. And when I got into a lot of deep discussions, it was like, well, we don't know if doctrinally that's actually how it is. I was like, oh, but I feel it like deep in my soul, you know?
Yeah.
So it was very enlightening and kind of a breath of fresh air to have a church that really like endorsed some of those beliefs and had them as like not a central core belief because that's in Christ being our savior, but having it be very, those beliefs being very, like they orbited very close to the center. And so I got baptized, and then I went to a Presbyterian college in Nebraska for a year. I just felt like I was missing something. I was one of the only LDS people on campus. The only ward for young single adults was 2-hour drive away.
Oh, wow.
And then church at that time was 3 hours. So 2 hours there, 3 hours at church. And then because you don't get to see a lot of people very much of the same faith, they always did like a linger longer. And then it was 2 hours back.
So a whole day.
It was a whole day. And it was very isolating. And so I talked to our wonderful bishop and I was like, hey, it's really isolating. I haven't even been a member for a year. I feel like I'm holding my own, but I'm not progressing the way that I would want to. Both academically, it was a breeze. I was anticipating things being a little bit more challenging, and I wanted to get into medical school and I didn't want to be behind. But a big driving factor in my transferring to BYU too was I was very new to the faith. I was the only member in my family. And when they would ask me things, it's kind of like now being a first year medical student when you go home for the holidays and stuff, people are like, "Oh, look at this weird mole. Oh, look at this. I have this." And you're like, "I've done 3 units. I'm not a doctor yet. I don't know." It kind of felt like that too, where it's like, I haven't even been a member for a year and I'm still like learning and building a testimony. And I have a lot going for me, but I'm still a baby. And babies don't do well growing up by themselves. So, yeah, I transferred to BYU and it was a blessing and it was a challenge, but I grew a lot. And that gave me the opportunity to go to Jerusalem, which changed my life, and to be around many of the religions that I did. I looked into when I was 12 or 13 when my friend died, and I was looking for answers and to really gain an in-depth appreciation for deeply held beliefs that are very similar to ours, but also very different in how we practice and how we view things, particularly when you look at Old Testament books and interpretations of scripture and why people hold different beliefs than we do. Because it's actually like, while we can be very similar, those perspectives can be very deeply rooted. You take it for granted. You think everybody interprets something the same way you do because that's such like a foundational belief. And then you hear somebody else's interpretation and you go, oh, I can see suddenly where this is coming from, but before it would have never entered my mind to look at
Yeah.
it that way. After I graduated, I had maybe like my second crisis of faith, I suppose. Like, I feel like there's always, and it kind of goes to like the main topic of our podcast today, when you're thinking about when people decide to come into an organized faith as an institution and they are really, really active. And then sometimes it kind of like peters out and they seem to like leave for a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Some people leave and they never come back. Other times it's kind of like crests and troughs. Like it'll go up and down just based off of where people are spiritually and their needs that they have. For example, for me right now, being in medical school, I study like 6 days a week. Sundays can be one of the only days that I ever spend with my husband. It can be quite a big balance to try to make work when your time is really precious like that. Some people decide as a couple, yes, our time, we would like to go and spend it in church and serve in that way. Not everybody's like that. And they want to spend that time at home alone with their family because they don't have that time otherwise, or whatever other reason that they have. But whenever people do come back, there's typically a reason for it. It's not a great feeling when you decide to come back and people maybe aren't the most welcoming, or they look at you like, where have you been? Because not everybody knows the story. And some people wouldn't say that medical school or going through a hard time is a reason to miss church. Maybe that's not a reason in your family, but everybody works a little bit differently. And the main thing, at least for me, is that I've always kind of had this belief is An organized faith is a vehicle to help get you to God. That's the whole point. It gives you things and a roadmap to kind of get you there. But the most important thing is always going to be, are you walking with God? Are you trying to get back? Can you feel the spirit? Things like that.
Hmm.
And that's different for every person. And sometimes people feel the need to walk very, very close with God and with other people around. And church can be extremely edifying with things like that. Sometimes you feel like you need a teacher. Again, church, Bible studies, things like that, extremely edifying because you can scaffold off of what other people have learned and to help build your faith.
I'd love to
Sometimes,
go back for just a minute to what you
yeah,
said about when you come back to church and then maybe people aren't welcoming. They either say, or maybe you just get the sense that they're saying, "Where have you been? And why haven't you been here?" A little bit judged, right? I think that, like what you said about what you learned in Jerusalem, you assumed everybody thought the way you did, and then you learned that people didn't. And I think we kind of do the same thing with church. They assume that you're thinking like they did. So therefore they're saying, well, where have you been? But everybody's situation is different. Just like in Jerusalem, there's so many different perspectives. Really, nobody thinks the same, is what I really think. Nobody thinks exactly the same. You can't really look at somebody else and say anything because you really have no idea what's going on in their life and in their heart.
yeah, no, 100%. It's something that for me, and I have to check myself on this sometimes too, because, for example, like when my friends and I in undergrad were traveling and going to like national parks down in southern Utah, sometimes we would still go to church. We would make that extra effort depending on how we were feeling. Normally, I have the experience of feeling a little bit judged or sensitive, might be a better word, sensitive.
That's a
If
good
I
one. Yeah.
know that I haven't been in a long time. It's one thing to walk in if you know that you go every Sunday and you walk into a new building and you're like, yeah, I'm just visiting, like, whatever. And I'm never going to see anybody ever again. But if you haven't been to your ward in a while or you don't know your community very much, it can be hard sometimes to go back and feel really comfortable or like you belong.
So, what do you recommend for the people who are there every Sunday? What do you recommend? Like, is there something they can do or not do that would
I
help?
think I think it's a two-way street. So like for people who are coming back, I would say don't assume people are judging you if they haven't seen you or if they're not interacting with you as much as like they're interacting with each other. I would just say it's better to not assume the negative, I suppose.
Hmm.
And I like to attribute it to my own sensitivity as opposed to putting it on somebody else because I used to hate this phrase. I really used to when we worked in wound care, when one of our managers would say, like, the patient's perspective is reality for them because it's like, oh, but that's like not true. Like, they don't know. Like,
Let's just educate them.
yeah. And it's like, no, but like, perspective really is your reality. That's what you're operating with. And being humble enough to be like, okay, I'm feeling a little bit sensitive, or I feel a little bit out of place, or I don't feel like I'm part of the in group right now because I'm in a situation where I don't know anybody.
Hmm.
When that little nasty voice says, like, well, maybe they're judging you because they've never met you and they don't see you around and you don't have a calling, I just squish it and say, go away. I deserve to be here just as much as anybody else does. I am a child of God, and I deeply believe that, which means this whole process is about redemption and about getting closer. In the spot that I'm in right now, where I'm at church, I need to be here and I deserve to be here, and just really believing that. And nobody else except for God can really make that judgment on
And that
you.
really is the truth. It's you and God. The
Yeah.
church is a support for that, but it
Yeah.
is you and God, like you said.
Yeah, and that was something too where for me, a lot of the times when I have had my troughs in my activity, my thing has very much been like, have I been feeling edified in church? Has this been giving something to me that my soul needs to feel close? Or is it just a box that I'm ticking off to be like, okay, I did it. Check, I'm done. 2 hours of my day was go like if I walk away from church thinking like that was kind of a waste of my time, especially now with a med student perspective of like I only have so much time in my day and I can fill it up 100 times over and still not get everything done, unfortunately. It came down to kind of my priorities in a way of am I feeling spiritually edified? Am I feeling closer to God? Some weeks, yes. Some weeks, no. There's always maybe a lesson that you can be learning. It just kind of depends though, because like my husband and I have kind of a different perspective on this. He's like, if I am not getting anything out of it, I'm not going to go. Sometimes I try to have a little bit more of a perspective of nothing really touched my soul, or maybe I learned one thing that was new or piqued my interest, but the rest of the time, maybe I was sitting through a lot of babies crying and a lot of disruptions. And did I really walk away being like, oh, wow, that was a very edifying experience?
Yeah. You brought up something when we were chatting before we started recording the episode, and I really thought it was so valuable about that just because someone might not be in church that you don't know what's going on inside of them. And I'd love to have you talk a little bit about that.
It kind of feeds into what I was saying about, for me in particular, I'm more of an introverted person. Even when I was very, very active in going to church and having my callings, church was a kind of a selfish time for me. It was very much like a me thing. And it's awesome to interact with people, but I was very much there specifically to have my time with God when throughout the week, maybe I didn't have that opportunity. However, most of the time, I have felt some of the greatest spiritual edification when I've been doing my stuff on my own. That's not the same for everybody, but having a quiet time to read or contemplate, sometimes even listening to some of my like more spiritual music, it can bring a lot of insight where sometimes when you're, at least for me, running around kind of making sure that I'm doing the necessary things, it kind of gets like lost in the weeds. It's talked about in general conference all the time, right? Like personal scripture study, like ponderizing. I love that talk. Being mindful, I think, is something like a way to be spiritual.
Hmm.
And one of my favorite things that I found to keep me more spiritually engaged that nobody would ever notice is I pray a lot, but it's not in a very obvious way. It's kind of like I'm holding a conversation in my head with God, where like sometimes I get like little answers from the Spirit, and other times I'm just talking
Yeah.
and saying, like, that was really hard. I don't know if I can do this anymore. Or, that was really awesome. Thank you for that opportunity. And just kind of keeping him in the background isn't like the greatest way to say it, but like kind of. People joke about when we're on our devices and stuff, like, oh, my FBI agent is watching me and they know what I'm doing all the time, and haha. It's kind of like that, except for my FBI agent is
I
God. Like, he
I
knows what
love
I'm
that.
doing. I believe that he's on my side. And even if like I'm doing something inconsequential that's not going to affect his plan for me, it's helpful to me to be able to have my dumb little conversation in my head with him. Again, even if he doesn't answer, I think it's something that for me has taught me a lot of patience, because there have been times where I've been driving home or having a moment and been praying or talking to him. And it's like, why don't you say anything? You can tell that I'm struggling. And I know from my personal experience that maybe this is something trivial in the overall, and maybe this is something that isn't super grand. Like it would be nice to have an answer. Sometimes weeks later, I get an answer. And
Yeah.
it's like, oh, okay. But like if I hadn't have been actively maybe thinking about it in that frame of mind, it would have never occurred to me that like, oh, he met a need there for me
Yeah.
or created an opportunity for me to meet my own need. And I think that's when the scriptures talk about like praying always. It's not, at least for me, it's not always down on my knees, head bowed in a very reverent manner. I take it to heart, or I took it to heart when my mom taught me when I was young, like, he wants to be your best friend. He wants to know what's going on with you. He wants to have that kind of deep relationship with you where you want to tell him the good news and you want to tell him the bad news. And I really did take that to heart. And it's something that, like, I don't think a lot of people actually know about me is that I'm constantly doing that. It's become a habit over the years.
Yeah.
That most of the time now I realize I'm doing it, but then most of the time I don't realize I'm doing it until I'm like, oh, okay.
Yeah. I think it's very evident that you have a relationship with God. You love God, you trust him. You're asking him and sharing with him, and you have that communication happening with God. From somebody on an outside perspective who's only looking at where you are and what you're doing that's visible to everybody, they might say, "Oh, well, Natalie, yeah, she's not in church every week, and yeah, we don't really know if she's active." Like they have no idea, none of what
Yeah.
is inside of you, of your relationship with God. And what is really evident through this conversation for me is that I'm thinking of like my own children, and I'm thinking, I have a child that I recently learned that even though she doesn't go to church and hasn't been to church in years, she does pray. And it
Mhm.
probably looks a lot more like the kind of prayer that you're describing than a traditional prayer. And who cares? Like having a relationship with God is the thing. It
Mhm.
is the goal. And I have other children. I have no idea really where they're at. And none of us really know where anyone else is at inside. It's really between us and God. That message is just coming through so clear for me as you're sharing.
I remember when I was baptized, my mom was actually really concerned about because she was like, listen, I raised you in faith, but we never went to church really regularly. And I want you to know that her interpretation of the scripture, like your body is a temple. She took that very literally, not just in the sense of treating your physical body well, but also being like, this is a space where the spirit can reside and where you can have a relationship with God. And she's like, but that's up to you to decide. You can base everything off of your outward expression of faith, or
Hmm.
it can be based off of inward. And I do think that there is a balance to that because you can have a great, great relationship with God. And it doesn't matter whether your vehicle to get there is through church and an institution that helps you get there, or whether it's your own personal beliefs. You still benefit from having a crisscross because you're a free thinking human being. You have free will. You have your own experiences that when you're doing your own personal prayer or study, you bring to church with you, no matter which church it is. I still love to church hop. I still love it because it teaches me so much every time. You then bring that with that next group of people, and you can be the person that's like, well, I learned this thing. What are your thoughts on that? And it's like, you never know what you can bring to the table just by learning somebody else's perspective or from doing your own homework. I feel like people think it's very daunting, especially I know I did to a degree when I first listened to my first general conference, and it was talking about like study your scriptures every day and pray every day and go to church and do your calling. It sounds so daunting because it's a big responsibility,
Hmm.
but it doesn't make you less than anybody else if you say, you know what, I'm just praying every day and I'm leaning on my prior testimony, whatever it is. It can be really big, it can be really small. Like small acts lead to big things. And you just start where you're at, which was one of the things, I think it was Dieter Uchtdorf
Uchtdorf?
said that, yeah, at the first general conference I ever watched before I converted. And that was something that really clicked my brain into actually listening. Because from somebody coming into this who had been to a bunch of churches and had seen like televangelists and stuff, when you see general conference, you're like, I know what this is. Maybe you do, maybe you don't. Because I thought it was going to be some televangelist, doing their thing. And when Elder Uchtdorf said, or President Uchtdorf said that, it was like, oh, you're not telling me to like throw away everything that has led me to this point. You're saying hold on to that and bring it with you, which was very comforting because it's like God gives you experiences and you have this life that in the LDS faith, we focus a lot on free will. You've made choices and you've had consequences that have made you the person that you are. And you take that with you, despite the fact that we are all very flawed. There are meaningful experiences there that other people can benefit from and that you can take with you. That was something that was very comforting about this. And I do tend to lean on that a little bit more when I've been away for a while. It's like, well, what have I learned on my own?
Hmm.
What am I potentially bringing back and trying to come in with like a very open mind of what is this perspective? I've lived in a lot of different wards now in a lot of different states. Even though the format is the same and the core beliefs are there, the flavor of person is a bit different from state to state. That's a wonderful thing because it gives you a perspective and it challenges you in a way that maybe you've never been challenged before. And maybe I'm a little bit of a black sheep in this, but I kind of like it when people challenge that for me because it's like, oh, well, either I'm able to defend it and say, like, no, this is still what I believe, or like, maybe it's time for a little bit of a paradigm shift. I've never quite thought about it that way. Let me contemplate and let me do some research. Let me come back to that. That's what's helped me grow.
And one
Secure.
of the things I really like about what you're saying is I can tell that you don't have any fear. I think sometimes when people are raised in this faith, or maybe probably any faith, that they don't necessarily want to look at other faiths or look at other ways of thinking out of fear because they just want to hold on to what they know is right and they don't want to deviate. They just want to like have these blinders on and go forward. You don't have that. And probably because of your background and your just your experiences and your perspective, you don't have that. You're willing to look at and pull from any source that brings you more truth into who you already know you are in your relationship with God. And I think that's so cool. I wish that we could all have that. One thing that you said to me back when we had that conversation about a year ago, more than a year ago, I think, you said to me that you'd had some friends who had left the church, and you said something that I have just kept in my mind. And I just like you to address it briefly if you could. You said sometimes people have to leave to truly come back. I'd love just you to just explain that a little bit before we wrap up.
Numerous friends in my life who I met throughout college or back in high school who were members of the church have ended up leaving. I still love them to bits and pieces. I understand where their perspective is, and it's their spiritual journey. That it came from a very personal experience that I had. Again, I brought this up earlier. My first crisis of faith that really tested me was when one of my friends died in middle school. He was struck by a car and nobody ever saw it coming. I couldn't wrap my mind around why. You understand that people die young and you understand that good people die in this world and that there is a lot of pain and suffering. But when it happens to you, you begin to question, like, are you even there? What are you doing? Why? I was mad. I prayed for 3 months, which is the start of me learning how to pray. But it was kind of at the time, it was me really starting to gain a relationship with God. And he didn't answer for like 3 months. I prayed for 3 months as a 12-year-old fervently to get like some sort of confirmation that he was okay. And on the third month, like to the day, I got a dream where I got to see him. I got to talk to him, and he told me, I'm fine. Everything's fine. And not everybody gets, it's kind of like one of those conference talks again. I forget who it was by, but it talks about light. And some people have a light bulb moment. Other people have kind of a dawning that is so gradual, they don't even realize that it's happening. I was fortunate enough to have a light bulb moment. I finally had this dream that was unlike any other dreams I've ever had. It was so realistic and had things in it that I could not make up. That was when I knew, I really knew that he was listening. But that was also around the time too when my anger really faded away. Two was 3 months after. And I believe deeply in my soul that he was waiting for me to not be angry at him because knowing myself, if I was still angry when my prayer was answered, I could have attributed to anything and would have just maybe taken it for granted.
Yeah.
And during that whole time, I was looking at a bunch of different faiths. I read the Quran. I read everything I could get my hands on. You can't see this because it's a podcast, but like maybe a couple millimeters away from taking more of like a Wiccan belief system, as a lot of 12-year-old girls do. I do believe that he put this in my way too. Somebody had rewritten one of Psalms to fit more of that narrative, that Wiccan belief system. And it was so beautiful that it made me cry. And right at the bottom, in some very, very fine print, it said, "This poem is rewritten from Psalms." I never ran so fast for my Bible in my entire life because I wanted to read it, the original. And I just remember I was sitting there. This was before I ever had my dream. This is what made the anger go away. I was bawling and crying because I had had that in my nightstand the whole time. And I was looking for everything else. And I was so close to walking away. And my mom was like, "Honey, I'll support you in whatever you decide to do. Just be really sure." I'm like, I'm 12.
This is all pretty incredible for a 12-year-old.
Uh, and I just cried and I cried because, like I said, it was sitting in my nightstand the whole time. And I felt like I had pushed him so hard away because I was so angry. And yeah, it was very gentle too, because it was in fine print. It wasn't like right in my face. It was just like, oh, I saw it. And then I realized that he had been there the whole time. And I got that dream shortly after. And I knew not everybody has that experience, but I think that's why I am so fearless, is because I know that he can handle whatever I throw at him. And I'm no Job. Sometimes I'm awful and I curse him. And I say, "I'm mad at you. How dare you do that to my family? How dare you do that to me, to my loved ones?" He's always right there when I decide to turn back around and say, "Oh, you never left me." There's a story called Footprints in the Sand.
Hmm.
I actually first encountered it that first summer after my friend died. My sister took me to the beach for the very first time for my 13th birthday. We were in this dinky little shop with tacky, souvenirs. And that story was on the wall. And it was the first time I ever read it. And I feel like people are going to get this idea that I'm a big crybaby, but I'm really not.
You're
But
really not.
like, again, I'm sitting there in this shack by the beach looking at all of these souvenirs, and I'm in the corner reading this. And I just started crying again. And like, I had to pull myself together because I knew my sister would be like, "What are you doing? Why are you crying?" And she doesn't sound like that. She sounds a lot like me, but it was like, oh my gosh, like I didn't realize that I was being carried in those moments where my footprints were by myself. Or those kinds of things really, I think, shaped my foundation to, as you said, maybe be fearless.
Yeah.
Because again, I view him like a best friend or a father that I have like a good relationship with. You can take anything to him. If there's something that somebody says or something that an institution does that I disagree with, I know that people are imperfect. I can take it to him though and wait for my answer.
Do you happen to remember what psalm it was? The one you were talking about?
Yes, it's Psalm 23. It's just, "The Lord is my shepherd." It's a very common one that everybody knows. It's very, very short. It's only 6 verses. It comes right after Psalm 22, obviously, but it's David lamenting to God about, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? Why art thou so far from helping me and from the words of my roaring?" And it goes, that's a 31 verse psalm. And then right after, 23 was the one that was rewritten. It fits so perfectly what I felt like I was going through as a 12-year-old who lost a friend.
Yeah.
You can just see the way that these open up. Like something happened to David in between, where throughout Psalm 22, you can see that he's angry and the tone shifts and it goes from, "Why art thou not help, like, why art thou so far from helping me," to, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want."
Wow. That gives me chills.
But yeah, sometimes to the rest of the world, it seems like you have left the building and you're not coming back. And sometimes you will tell people, "I am not coming back." When people do tell you that though, I would urge you, give them that respect, believe them. Don't like give them like this little mischievous look and be like, "It's okay, you'll be back." It's like, don't do that. Believe them when they say that. but we're ever changing, and God is the only thing that is constant. People can come back. Sometimes people don't come back, but if they don't come back, don't assume that they're not doing spiritual work or that they haven't found something that edifies their spirit and brings them closer.
That's beautiful. Natalie, thank you so much for being here with me today. Thank you so much for sharing your beautiful perspective. It's so valuable. I knew the very first time we talked about this that I needed other people to hear what you had to say. So thank you for taking the time out of your very busy medical school schedule to have this conversation with me.
Well, I'm
And
honored that you asked me, so thank you.
you're welcome. And for my listeners, you may be thinking of somebody else who could benefit from listening to Natalie's words, from listening to this episode. I invite you to share this podcast episode with them and help ease their pain, help them gain greater understanding and peace with their loved ones. Please join me again next time for another episode of Just Love Them.